The sun had not yet risen over the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944. Lieutenant Commander Alan Roby stood on the bridge of the USS KIDD, a Fletcher-class destroyer that had been his home for the past 9 months. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the railing, watching as the massive Japanese carrier fleet, the pride of the Imperial Navy, emerged through the morning mist some 20 miles distant. Radio chatter indicated American aircraft were already launching from Admiral Mitcher's carriers, but Roby knew the grim mathematics of naval warfare. The Japanese had positioned their fleet beyond the operational range of American aircraft. By the time U.S. planes reached them, they would have barely enough fuel to make a single attack run before being forced to ditch in the open ocean. "Sir, new orders from Task Force 58, his communications officer called, voice tight with tension. "All destroyer units are to maintain protective positions around the carriers." Roby acknowledged the command with a curt nod, but his eyes never left the horizon. Standard doctrine demanded he keep his vessel in the protective screen around the American fleet. Yet something inside him, an instinct honed through years of naval combat, told him there was another way. If the KIDD broke formation now and pushed ahead at flank speed, they could mark the Japanese fleet position with smoke and die. It would give the American pilots a visible target to aim for, extending their effective range by critical miles. It would also mean deliberately disobeying a direct order in the middle of the largest carrier battle in naval history. "Signal the engine room," Roby said quietly, his decision made. Full steam ahead. No one aboard the USS KIDD that morning could have known that one commander's calculated act of insubordination would not only save hundreds of American pilots, but help deliver what history would later call the greatest carrier victory of World War II. Alan Roby was born on May 7, 1914, in the small coastal town of Gloucester, Massachusetts. The son of a commercial fisherman, Roby grew up with salt water in his veins and the rhythm of the tides in his blood. His father, James Roby, operated a small fishing trawler that sailed out each morning before dawn and returned with the day's catch as the sun began to set. Young Alan would often accompany his father during summer breaks from school, learning to read weather patterns, navigate by stars, and understand the temperament of the ocean. "The sea doesn't care about your plans," his father would tell him. "It only respects those who respect it." This practical education in maritime judgment would later prove more valuable than any textbook strategy taught at Annapolis. By the time Alan was 15, he could pilot the family boat with the confidence of a veteran sailor. His mother, Eleanor, a school teacher with a passion for mathematics, ensured that her son's education on land was equally rigorous. She recognized in Alan a quick, calculating mind, one that could process angles, distances, and probabilities with unusual clarity. When Alan graduated from high school in 1932, the Great Depression had devastated the fishing industry in New England. With few opportunities in Gloucester, he applied to the United States Naval Academy, seeing it as both a way to serve his country and a path to financial stability. His exceptional scores in mathematics and physics, combined with a recommendation letter from a local congressman who had been impressed by young Roby's seamanship during a community event, secured his admission. At Annapolis, Roby was neither the most sociable cadet nor the most politically connected. His working-class background made him something of an outsider among classmates who often came from military families or privileged upbringings. What distinguished Roby was his intuitive understanding of naval operations and his unorthodox approach to tactical problems. During war games and simulations, he frequently proposed solutions that contradicted established doctrine but achieved superior results. "Mr. Roby thinks like a fishing boat captain, not a naval officer," one instructor noted on his evaluation, a comment intended as criticism but which Roby took as a compliment. The practical knowledge gained from years on his father's trawler had taught him that the rigid application of rules rarely survived contact with the unpredictable nature of the sea. After graduating in 1936, Ensign Roby served on various vessels in the Atlantic Fleet. When the United States entered World War II following the attack on Pearl Harbor, he was serving as a lieutenant aboard the destroyer USS Meredith. He participated in several convoy escort missions across the Atlantic, protecting vital supply ships from German U-boat attacks. During one particularly harrowing encounter off the coast of Iceland in 1942, Roby coordinated an innovative anti-submarine maneuver that successfully protected a convoy despite being outnumbered by enemy submarines. His actions caught the attention of senior naval command, and by early 1943 he was promoted to lieutenant commander and given executive officer duties aboard the USS KIDD, a newly commissioned Fletcher-class destroyer. 6 months later, when the ship's commanding officer was transferred, Roby assumed command, becoming one of the youngest destroyer commanders in the Pacific Fleet. The crew initially viewed him with skepticism. At 29 years old, he seemed too young for such responsibility. His quiet demeanor and habit of spending hours studying weather reports and ocean current charts rather than socializing with other officers only added to their doubts. But, as Machinist's mate, First Class Frank Deloria, would later recall, "We thought we got stuck with some bookworm from Annapolis who'd never get his hands dirty. Then we hit our first typhoon, and while other skippers were fighting to keep their bearings, Commander Roby had already plotted a course that rode the storm's edge perfectly. After that, there wasn't a man aboard who wouldn't follow him anywhere." What none of them realized was that Roby had been preparing for a moment like the one that would arrive on June 19, 1944, a moment when understanding the sea, the sky, and the capabilities of both his vessel and his enemies would make the difference between victory and defeat. There are times, he wrote in a letter to his father in early 1944, when the right action and the allowed action aren't the same thing. I pray I'll know the difference when it matters most. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between hundreds of American aviators and certain death in the vast emptiness of the Philippine Sea. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had reached a critical juncture. American forces, having slowly clawed back territory from the Japanese Empire since the darkest days following Pearl Harbor, were now pushing westward across the Central Pacific. The strategic island of Saipan in the Marianas Chain had become the next objective, a crucial stepping stone that would place American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The Japanese Imperial Navy, recognizing the existential threat that the loss of Saipan represented, mobilized virtually every operational warship in their inventory for a decisive counterattack. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded a force of 9 aircraft carriers, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 28 destroyers, a naval armada that represented Japan's last, best hope of stemming the American advance. Against this force, the United States Navy deployed Task Force 58 under the command of Admiral Mark Mitchell. This American fleet consisted of 15 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers, including the USS KIDD. The stage was set for what naval historians would later call the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but which American sailors would immortalize with a simpler name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The battle began on June 19, 1944, when Japanese land-based aircraft from Guam attacked the American fleet. These initial strikes were repelled with minimal damage to U.S. ships, but they revealed the position of Task Force 58 to Japanese scout planes. Admiral Ozawa, believing he had caught the Americans by surprise, launched a massive airstrike from his carriers. What the Japanese admiral didn't realize was that the Americans had broken Japanese naval codes weeks earlier. Admiral Mitchell knew the enemy fleet was coming and had positioned his forces accordingly. When the Japanese aircraft arrived, they flew into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of Hellcat fighters. By day's end, more than 300 Japanese aircraft had been shot down, with American losses numbering fewer than 30 planes. This one-sided aerial victory, however, was only the prelude to a more complex strategic problem. Despite decimating the Japanese air groups, the American fleet had been unable to locate Ozawa's carrier force. The Japanese admiral had kept his ships beyond the range of American search planes, creating a dilemma for Admiral Mitcher: launch a long-range strike that might not find its target, or wait for the Japanese fleet to close the distance. By mid-afternoon, American scout planes finally located the Japanese fleet approximately 275 miles away, at the extreme edge of the combat radius for American carrier aircraft. Mitcher faced an agonizing decision. If he launched an attack, his pilots might reach the Japanese ships, but would almost certainly run out of fuel on the return journey, forcing them to ditch in the open ocean. If he didn't launch, he risked allowing the Japanese fleet to escape. After brief deliberation, Mitcher gave the order: "Launch 'em!" More than 200 American aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes took off from their carriers and set course for the distant Japanese fleet. It was in this context that Lieutenant Commander Roby and the crew of the USS KIDD found themselves at the crossroads of history. Standard naval doctrine required destroyer captains to maintain their positions in the protective screen around the American carriers. Any deviation without direct orders would be considered a serious breach of discipline, potentially even desertion of duty during combat operations. Yet Roby understood something that wasn't captured in operational orders. He knew that with the fading daylight and the extreme distance involved, American pilots would struggle to locate the Japanese fleet. Even if they found it, they would have precious little fuel for combat maneuvering before beginning the long return flight. Many would be forced to ditch their aircraft in the darkness of the open ocean, where rescue would be nearly impossible. The orders from Task Force Command were explicit. All destroyer units maintain protective positions around carriers. But as Roby stood on the bridge of the KIDD, calculating distances, fuel consumption rates, and the rapidly setting sun, he saw a different equation. If his destroyer broke formation now, pushing ahead at maximum speed, they could potentially reach a position where they could mark the Japanese fleet's location with smoke and die. This visible reference point might save dozens, perhaps hundreds, of pilots. The mathematics of the situation were stark. Each American pilot who couldn't find his way back to the fleet represented not just the loss of a trained aviator, but also the loss of an irreplaceable aircraft. The United States could produce planes faster than Japan, but trained pilots were a resource that couldn't be quickly replaced. Captain Daniel Reynolds of the aircraft carrier USS Lexington would later write in his after-action report, "We knew when we launched that strike that we were sending some of those boys on a one-way trip. The fuel calculations gave them maybe 5 minutes over the target area. If they missed it on the first pass, they wouldn't have enough gas to circle back for a second try, let alone make it home." It was this reality that weighed on Roby's mind as he made his fateful decision. Lieutenant James Thatcher, the KIDD's executive officer, approached his commander with concern etched on his face. "Sir, Task Force is signaling again. All destroyers are to maintain their stations." Roby nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "I heard the order, Mr. Thatcher." "Sir, if we break formation without authorization—" "I know the regulations, James." Roby cut him off, his voice quiet but firm. "I also know there are 200 American pilots heading into the sunset, with barely enough fuel to reach their targets, let alone get back." He turned to face his second-in-command. His decision made. "Signal the engine room, all ahead flank, and have the quartermaster prepare our smoke generators and sea-dye markers." Thatcher hesitated only briefly, before responding, "Aye, Captain," and moving to relay the orders. As the USS KIDD surged forward, breaking from the protective formation around the American carriers, Roby knew he was risking his career, possibly even a court-martial. But some calculations went beyond military regulations. This was about the lives of hundreds of fellow servicemen, many barely out of their teens, who would soon be flying through darkening skies with fuel gauges approaching empty. No one understood the stakes better than the pilots themselves. Lieutenant Robert Duncan, flying an F-6F Hellcat with Fighting Squadron 15, later described the mission When they told us the distance, every man in that ready room did the same mental calculation. We all knew we had enough gas to get there and maybe, just maybe, get halfway back. But orders were orders, and no one hesitated. You don't let your buddies go alone on a mission like that. As the American aircraft winged toward the Japanese fleet, they flew into what many expected would be their final sunset. Behind them, breaking from the safety of the American fleet formation, the USS KIDD raced ahead on a mission of its own, one that would soon challenge the very definition of duty in combat. The USS KIDD cut through the waves at 35 knots, its bow throwing up sheets of white spray as Lieutenant Commander Roby pushed the Fletcher-class destroyer to its operational limits. The powerful engines vibrated through the hull as black smoke poured from the stacks, marking their position against the darkening eastern sky. On the bridge, tension hung in the air like a physical presence. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, but sideways glances betrayed their unspoken questions about their commander's decision. They had left the protective formation of Task Force 58 nearly an hour earlier and were now sailing alone through waters potentially patrolled by Japanese submarines. "Radio from flagship, sir," the communications officer reported, his voice carefully neutral. "Admiral Mitcher is demanding our return to station. They're coding it as a Priority 1 order." Roby accepted the message form without comment, reading it twice before folding it deliberately and placing it in his pocket. The bridge crew studiously avoided looking at him, focusing intently on their stations. "Acknowledge receipt of message," Roby finally said, "but maintain course and speed." He turned to his executive officer. "Mr. Thatcher, I want all hands at general quarters. If there are Japanese submarines in these waters, we're a prime target." "Aye, sir," Thatcher replied, then hesitated. "Captain, the men are asking questions. They know we've broken formation." Roby nodded slowly. "Tell them the truth. We're attempting to provide a visual marker for our air group. Once they've completed their mission, we'll rejoin the task force." He paused. "Also, tell them that this decision is mine alone. If there are consequences, they will fall on no one else." The ship's intercom crackled to life moments later as Thatcher explained their mission to the crew. When he finished, there was a brief silence throughout the ship, followed by the sound of men moving to their battle stations with renewed purpose. Roby checked his watch. The American strike force had launched nearly 2 hours earlier. Given their speed and the distance to the Japanese fleet, they would be approaching their targets soon, if they could find them. "Radar, any contacts?" he called. "Negative, Captain," came the reply. "No surface contacts within range." Roby calculated their position relative to the last reported location of the Japanese fleet. They were still at least 50 miles away, too far to provide the visual marker he had hoped for. Time was running against them. In the radio room, Radioman First Class Paul Martinez sat hunched over his equipment, headphones pressed tightly against his ears. A native of San Antonio, Texas, Martinez had joined the Navy 3 days after Pearl Harbor, leaving behind his position as a telegraph operator for Southern Pacific Railroad. His ability to distinguish faint signals amid radio static had saved the KIDD from ambush twice before. "Sir," Martinez called over the internal communication system, "I'm picking up Japanese radio traffic, bearing 045, signal strength increasing." Roby immediately ordered a course correction. "Helm, come to new heading 045, maintain flank speed." The KIDD heeled slightly as it altered course, now racing directly toward the source of the Japanese transmissions. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only a fading band of orange light in the western sky. Night was falling rapidly, as it always did in the tropics. 20 minutes later, Martinez reported again. "Multiple signals now, sir, consistent with fleet communications. I'd estimate they're less than 30 miles ahead." Roby nodded grimly. They were getting close, dangerously close to the Japanese fleet, but they still hadn't spotted them visually, and without visual confirmation, they couldn't provide the marker needed to guide the American aircraft. "Captain," the lookout called suddenly, "aircraft approaching from the west. Multiple contacts." Roby raised his binoculars. Against the last light of the setting sun, he could make out the silhouettes of American planes. the leading edge of Mitcher's strike force, already on their way to the target. "Radar, anything ahead of us?" he demanded. "Sir, I have faint returns at extreme range. Bearing 043, distance approximately 28 miles. "That's them," Robbie said quietly. He turned to his executive officer. "Mr. Thatcher, prepare to launch star shells and commence smokescreen. We're going to light up the sky." "Sir," Thatcher objected, "at that range, we'll reveal our position to the entire Japanese fleet without being able to effectively mark their location for our aircraft." Roby shook his head. "We're not marking the Japanese position. We're marking ours." Seeing his officer's confusion, he explained, "Those pilots are flying on fumes. They need a reference point to orient themselves. If we can establish our position relative to both fleets, we can provide radio guidance to help them find their targets." Understanding dawned on Thatcher's face. "We'll be a navigation beacon." "Exactly. And when they've completed their attack runs, we'll light up again to help guide them home." It was a daring plan, and one that would place the KIDD in extraordinary danger. By making themselves visible, they would potentially draw the attention of the entire Japanese fleet. A lone destroyer would stand little chance against concentrated enemy fire, but the alternative was unthinkable. Without some form of guidance, many of the American planes would miss their targets or waste precious fuel searching. Either way, they would run out of fuel before reaching the safety of their carriers. "Radio, this is the captain," Robbie called. "Broadcast on the Air Group tactical frequency. Message as follows. Stryker elements, this is KIDD. We are at position Able Baker 37. Japanese fleet bearing 043 from our position, distance 28 miles. We'll mark our position with star shells and smoke. Use as reference point. Acknowledge." For several tense seconds there was no response. Then Martinez's voice came through, excitement evident despite his professional demeanor. "Sir, multiple acknowledgments from strike aircraft. They've heard us." On Robbie's command, the KIDD's gunners loaded star shells into the 5-inch guns. These specialized shells were designed to burst high in the air, releasing parachute flares that would illuminate the area below. Simultaneously, the ship's smoke generators began pouring thick white smoke into the air, creating a visible plume that could be seen for miles. The first star shells burst above the KIDD, bathing the surrounding ocean in harsh white light. From the perspective of the approaching American pilots, it would appear as a sudden beacon in the growing darkness, a fixed point from which they could calculate the position of their targets. Aboard the USS Enterprise, Admiral Mitcher received the unexpected transmission from the KIDD with mixed emotions. The destroyer had clearly disobeyed orders to remain with the task force. Yet the navigational assistance it was now providing might save dozens, perhaps hundreds, of his pilots. "Send to KIDD," he ordered after a moment's reflection. "Message as follows. Maintain position, continue guidance, recovery evaluation, pending." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was tacit acknowledgement that Roby's gamble might prove worthwhile. The first American planes began passing overhead minutes later, adjusting their course based on the KIDD's position and the coordinates provided for the Japanese fleet. Roby and his crew watched as the strike aircraft, Avengers, Helldivers, and Hellcats streamed past in the gathering darkness, their running lights off to avoid early detection. Ensign Michael Harrington stood at his position on the port bridge wing, watching the American planes pass overhead. At 20 years old, the native of Omaha, Nebraska, was one of the youngest officers aboard the KIDD. Before the war, he had been studying engineering at the University of Nebraska. Now he found himself witnessing a moment that would later be recorded in naval history books. "They're going to make it," he said quietly. Roby, overhearing him, replied, "Getting there is only half the battle, Ensign. The real question is, how many will make it back?" As the last of the American aircraft passed beyond visual range, Roby ordered the star shells and smoke discontinued. Now they would wait and prepare for the more difficult task of guiding exhausted pilots back to their carriers in complete darkness. 15 minutes later, the distant rumble of explosions rolled across the water. The American strike had found its target. For the pilots of Task Force 58, the attack on the Japanese carrier fleet became a desperate race against fuel gauges ticking inexorably toward empty. Lieutenant Commander James Bradley, leading a squadron of SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Hornet, later described the final approach. "We came in low over the water, using the coordinates from the KIDD. Suddenly, there they were, carriers, battleships, the whole Japanese fleet spread out before us. We didn't have fuel for careful positioning. It was one pass, drop your ordnance, and pray you had enough gas to get clear." The American strike proved devastatingly effective. Despite the limited time over target, the aircraft managed to sink the carrier Hyo and damage the carriers Zuikaku, Junyo, and Ryujo, along with several supporting vessels. The Japanese combat air patrol, already depleted from earlier engagements, was unable to mount an effective defense against the determined American attack. As the American planes completed their attack runs, they faced their greatest challenge, finding their way back to their carriers across more than 200 miles of open ocean in complete darkness, with fuel tanks approaching empty. Aboard the USS KIDD, Lieutenant Commander Roby prepared for the next phase of his improvised mission. Radio, broadcast continuously on the Air Group tactical frequency, give our position and bearing to Task Force 58. Repeat every 2 minutes. Then he turned to his gunnery officer. "I want star shells fired at 5-minute intervals, maximum altitude. We need to be visible from at least 20 miles out." "Sir," the gunnery officer replied, "that will make us visible to any Japanese submarines in the area as well." "I'm aware of the risk," Roby replied, "but those pilots have only one chance to find their way home, and we're it." The KIDD star shells burst in the night sky like artificial stars, creating brief islands of light in the vast darkness of the Philippine Sea. Between illuminations, the ship's radio operators continuously broadcast guidance for the returning aircraft, providing course corrections and distance estimates to both the KIDD's position and the distant American carriers. The first returning planes appeared as faint shadows against the night sky about 45 minutes after the attack. Many were flying with empty fuel tanks, their engines beginning to sputter as the last drops of aviation gasoline were consumed. "This is Hornet Squadron Leader," came a crackling voice over the radio. "We have your position. 20-plus aircraft fuel critical. Request vector to nearest carrier." Martinez relayed the request to Roby, who immediately provided detailed coordinates and bearings to the American task force. As he did so, more radio calls came in, dozens of aircraft converging on the KIDD's El Suarez position, all desperately low on fuel. "Sir," Martinez called, his voice tight with concern, "I've got multiple aircraft reporting they can't make it back to the carriers. They're requesting permission to ditch near our position for rescue." Roby didn't hesitate. "Acknowledge all requests. Tell them we'll pick up anyone who goes into the water." He turned to Thatcher. "Prepare all boats for immediate launch. Rig additional lights along the hull. I want every inch of this ship visible to pilots ditching nearby." As the KIDD became an impromptu rescue ship, the danger of its position increased exponentially. The bright lights necessary for rescue operations made it an obvious target. Furthermore, Roby had taken the ship far from the protection of the American task force, placing it dangerously close to the Japanese fleet that was now in retreat, but still capable of launching a devastating counterattack. The first ditching occurred at 21:17 hours. An SBD Dauntless, its fuel exhausted, executed a controlled water landing less than half a mile from the KIDD. The destroyer immediately dispatched a whaleboat, retrieving the pilot and gunner within minutes. Over the next 2 hours, 14 more aircraft would ditch in the vicinity of the KIDD, bringing the total number of rescued airmen to 33. Meanwhile, the majority of the American strike force, guided by the KIDD signals, managed to reach the task force. Admiral Mitcher had ordered all carriers to turn on their lights, an unprecedented action that risked revealing the fleet's position but was necessary to guide the returning aircraft home. Lieutenant Robert Duncan, one of the Hellcat pilots who had participated in the strike, would later recall, "My fuel gauge was reading empty when I spotted those star shells from the KIDD. Without that reference point, I would have been flying blind. They gave me a heading, straight back to the task force. When I finally saw the carrier lights, I had maybe 30 seconds of flight time left. Not all aircraft made it back. Despite the efforts of the KIDD and the illuminated carriers, 76 planes were lost that night, most running out of fuel and ditching in areas where rescue was impossible. Yet, without the KIDD's actions, naval historians would later estimate that the losses might have been twice as high. By midnight, the KIDD had become a floating hospital, with injured airmen receiving treatment in the wardroom and crew quarters. The ship's normal complement of 320 men had been increased by the 33 rescued aviators. Stretching resources thin, Radioman Martinez approached Roby on the bridge, a message form in his hand. "Sir, new orders from Admiral Mitcher. We're to return to the task force immediately." Roby took the form, reading it carefully. There was no mention of his earlier disobedience, only coordinates for rendezvous and a terse acknowledgement of the rescued airmen. "Acknowledge the order," Roby said. "Set course for the rendezvous point, best possible speed considering our additional passengers." As the KIDD turned back toward the American task force, Roby allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had knowingly violated direct orders, risking his command and, potentially, his career. Yet the results spoke for themselves. 33 men who would otherwise be floating helplessly in the vast Pacific were now safely aboard his ship, and dozens more had been guided back to their carriers. "Was it worth it, sir?" Thatcher asked quietly, seemingly reading his commander's thoughts. Roby gazed out at the dark horizon. "Ask me again when we reach the task force." The USS KIDD rejoined Task Force 58 shortly after dawn on June 20th, 1944. As the destroyer approached the American fleet, its decks crowded with rescued aviators, an unexpected scene unfolded. Sailors on the nearby carriers and battleships lined the railings, many rendering salutes to the small ship that had broken formation to save their comrades. Lieutenant Commander Roby stood on the bridge, outwardly composed, but inwardly preparing himself for the consequences of his actions. He fully expected to be relieved of command upon rejoining the fleet. Disobeying direct orders during combat operations, regardless of the outcome, typically resulted in severe disciplinary action. A signal flag message from the fleet flagship directed the KIDD to come alongside the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise for personnel transfer. As they maneuvered into position, Roby could see Admiral Mitcher himself standing on the flag bridge, watching their approach through binoculars. The transfer of the rescued airmen proceeded efficiently. Each man, before crossing from the destroyer to the carrier, made a point of shaking Roby's hand. Many were openly emotional, understanding how close they had come to being lost at sea. "They told me you broke formation to guide us in," one lieutenant said quietly as he gripped Roby's hand. "My wife's expecting our first child next month. I wouldn't be meeting him if not for you and your crew." When the last aviator had been transferred, a messenger from the Enterprise delivered a sealed envelope to Roby. Inside was a brief message. "Commander Roby to report to Admiral Mitcher immediately." Crossing to the carrier, Roby was escorted to the Admiral's quarters. He entered, saluted crisply, and prepared himself for the formal reprimand that would likely end his command. Admiral Mark Mitcher was a legendary figure in naval aviation, known for his tactical brilliance and unwavering dedication to his pilots. He was also a strict disciplinarian who expected orders to be followed without question. He studied Roby for a long moment before speaking. "You deliberately disobeyed a direct order, Commander," he said finally, his voice neutral. "Yes, sir," Roby replied simply. "You placed your ship at unnecessary risk, potentially compromising the security of the entire task force. I accept full responsibility for my actions, sir." Mitcher nodded slowly. "You also saved 33 of my airmen and guided countless others back to their carriers." He paused. "The question I'm struggling with, Commander, is whether to court-martial you or recommend you for a commendation." Before Roby could respond, Mitcher continued. "Naval operations require discipline and adherence to the chain of command. Without it, we have chaos. Yet sometimes the situation on the ground, or in this case, at sea, Requires initiative that goes beyond standing orders. He turned to look out the porthole toward the USS KIDD, still positioned alongside the Enterprise. I've read your service record. You have a habit of unorthodox thinking that makes some of your superior officers uncomfortable. You also have an instinct for the sea that can't be taught at the academy. Turning back to Roby, he said, I won't be recommending disciplinary action, Commander. Nor will there be an official commendation. What happened yesterday will remain between us, the pilots you saved, and your crew. Roby, who had been prepared for the worst, found himself momentarily speechless. Thank you, sir, he finally managed. Mitchell held up a hand. Don't thank me yet. I'm not doing you any favors. The report will state that the KIDD was dispatched on a special reconnaissance mission, which is technically true. But every pilot in this fleet knows what really happened, and word spreads quickly in the Navy. He fixed Roby with a penetrating gaze. Some will call you a hero, others will call you reckless. Both may be right. Just understand that the next time you feel compelled to ignore orders, the outcome may be very different. Roby nodded solemnly. I understand, sir. Good. Now, get back to your ship. We still have a war to win. As Roby returned to the KIDD, he found his crew watching him anxiously. The story of their midnight rescue operation had already spread throughout the task force, and they were uncertain whether their commander would be returning or being replaced. When he stepped back aboard, Executive Officer Thatcher was the first to approach him. What happened, sir? Roby surveyed the faces of his men before responding. We've been officially recognized for conducting a special reconnaissance mission. There will be no further discussion of any deviation from orders. Is that clear? A mixture of relief and understanding passed through the assembled crew. Aye, sir, they responded in near unison. Now let's get this ship back in formation where it belongs, Roby ordered, turning toward the bridge. The Battle of the Philippine Sea concluded as one of the most decisive American victories of the Pacific War. The Japanese carrier fleet, having lost 3 carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft and pilots, would never again mount a serious offensive operation. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American sailors called it, effectively ended Japanese naval air power as a significant threat. The role of the USS KIDD in this historic battle would remain largely unacknowledged in official reports. Lieutenant Commander Alan Roby continued to command the destroyer through subsequent campaigns, including the battles of Leyte Gulf and Okinawa. His personnel file contained no mention of either commendation or reprimand for his actions during the Philippine Sea engagement. When the war ended in August 1945, Roby, like thousands of other naval officers, returned to civilian life. He settled in his hometown of Gloucester, eventually taking over his father's fishing business and raising 3 children with his wife, Margaret, whom he had married during a brief shore leave in 1943. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences and never about the night when the KIDD stood alone between the American and Japanese fleets. But twice each year, on June 19th and on Christmas Day, he would receive calls and letters from men whose lives he had saved. Over time, these communications extended to include the children and grandchildren of those aviators, many named Alan in his honor. In 1962, nearly 18 years after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Roby received an unexpected visitor at his modest harborside home. Admiral Chester Nimitz, long retired from his position as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, had come to Gloucester for a fishing tournament. He made a point of seeking out the former destroyer commander. Over coffee on Roby's porch overlooking the harbor, Nimitz finally broached the subject that had brought him there. You know, I never approved of what you did with the KIDD, the Admiral said directly. Breaking formation without orders goes against everything the Navy stands for. Roby nodded, accepting the criticism from the legendary commander. Yes, sir, I understood that at the time. Nimitz sipped his coffee before continuing. However, Mitchell told me the full story before he passed. Said it was the finest example of initiative he'd seen in the war. He fixed Roby with the penetrating gaze that had once commanded the largest naval force in history. Sometimes being right matters more than being authorized, But don't ever tell anyone I said that." Roby smiled slightly. "Your secret is safe with me, Admiral." When Nimitz left, he handed Roby a small package. Inside was a silver model of the USS KIDD with a simple inscription. Sometimes the unwritten orders are the most important ones. Alan Roby passed away in 1986 at the age of 72. His obituary in the Gloucester Times made no mention of his unauthorized action during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It described him simply as a decorated naval officer and respected member of the fishing community. At his funeral, however, 17 elderly men, former naval aviators, formed an honor guard. Each placed a white rose on his casket, a silent acknowledgment of the night when a destroyer captain's calculated disobedience saved them from the vast emptiness of the Philippine Sea. The full story of the USS KIDD's role in the Battle of the Philippine Sea remained largely unknown until 1993, when naval historian Dr. Robert Clemens discovered a cache of personal letters from Task Force 58 pilots to their families. Multiple accounts referenced a destroyer that had broken formation to guide them home. Further research in declassified Navy archives confirmed the identity of the vessel as the USS KIDD. Dr. Clemens's subsequent book, Calculated Risk: The Untold Story of the USS KIDD, brought Roby's actions to public attention for the first time. The account sparked debate among naval strategists and military ethicists about the balance between discipline and initiative in combat situations. Captain James Holloway, a naval instructor at Annapolis, would later incorporate the KIDD incident into his teaching curriculum on command decision-making. What Commander Roby did violated naval doctrine, but fulfilled the highest purpose of command, accomplishing the mission while preserving the lives of his fellow servicemen. It raises profound questions about when rules should be followed and when they should be transcended. Perhaps the most telling epilogue came in 2001, when the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, established the Roby Award for Initiative in Combat Leadership. The award citation reads, "For actions that demonstrate the moral courage to deviate from established doctrine when circumstances demand, resulting in the preservation of both mission objectives and human life." The USS KIDD itself, preserved as a museum ship in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, makes no official mention of the events of June 19, 1944. But visiting naval veterans sometimes point to a small, unauthorized plaque mounted discreetly on the bridge. It bears no name, only a simple message that encapsulates Alan Roby's legacy. Sometimes the right course isn't on any chart. When we examine military history, we often focus on the grand strategies and decisive battles that shape the course of wars. Yet sometimes the most consequential actions are the small, unauthorized decisions made by individuals far from the spotlight, choices made not for glory, but from a deep understanding of what truly matters when lives hang in the balance. Lieutenant Commander Alan Roby's decision to break formation with the USS KIDD represents one of these pivotal moments, an action that saved dozens of lives directly and likely hundreds more indirectly by preserving crucial aircraft and experienced pilots at a critical juncture in the Pacific War. His story raises profound questions about military discipline versus individual initiative. When does adherence to orders become an impediment rather than a virtue? At what point does the responsibility of command transcend the chain of command? Perhaps most importantly, Roby's actions remind us that warfare is ultimately a human endeavor, not merely a clash of technologies or tactics. In the vast emptiness of the Philippine Sea, faced with the knowledge that American pilots were flying toward an almost certain death, one naval officer chose to place humanity above hierarchy. As we reflect on this largely unheralded moment in World War II history, we might ask ourselves, would we have had the courage to break formation as Roby did? Would we have risked career, reputation, and possibly court-martial to save others? Or would we have followed orders, keeping our destroyer in formation while pilots ditched in the darkness of the open ocean. The measure of true courage isn't found in following a prescribed path, but in recognizing when that path leads away from our deepest values. In that moment over the Philippine Sea, Alan Roby discovered what countless military leaders have learned throughout history. Sometimes the most loyal act is disobedience, and sometimes the truest discipline comes from breaking the rules. If you found this story meaningful, please share it so others can remember what true courage looks like, the quiet, calculated kind that puts others before self and moral clarity before blind obedience. And comment below with your thoughts on when following orders should yield to following one's conscience.